It's been nearly 3 years since we last went through every faction in Warhammer 3 to find the best units. In that time, we've had a whole new faction added to the fray alongside a tidal wave of new units for a range of existing factions. So the time has once again come to find out what is the best unit for every faction in Warhammer 3. Starting as always with the Beastmen, and some things haven't changed, and one of these things is that shielded Minotaurs are simply the best unit the Beastmen have, and maybe one of the best units in the game for the job they do. All Minotaurs are great, but the shielded ones are just the best all round, giving them an edge on the competition. The Beastmen are all about using speed and power to quite literally roll over enemy armies, and that is encapsulated in this unit. Very high speed for something so large, granted not as fast as some cavalry so they can be outrun, but infantry don't stand a chance, and that's really their main target. Once they land, they make a serious impact with very high armor piercing damage and even a decent charge. Now sure, their melee stats don't start out too great, but they'll get the job done against backlines and front, provided they're working with the army. The Bloodgreed passive ups their damage even further for every kill they get, and they should be getting plenty. They can also move unimpeded by forests and even hide, which is somewhat rare for units of this size. And lastly, the titular shields give them a huge increase to melee defense, a little armor, and of course the ability to block 50% of incoming missiles over regular Minotaurs. They carry just the same destructive power, but can also survive most things the game throws at them. Just an all-round great unit. From Bretonnia, we have the Grail Guardians, another faction that see no changes for a very long time, so no surprise their best unit is still the Grail Guardians, and it's not hard to see why. It's also not hard to see why you should be using instant gaming whenever you buy games. Look, I know you buy more video games than you can ever play with no plan on stopping. You want to know how I know? Fool, I'm doing the exact same thing, but the difference between you and I is that I'm using instant gaming and saving a bunch of money that I can use on, you guessed it, even more games. They have basically any game you could ask for on any platform you could play it on, all at the best prices you can find on the internet superhighway. There are new games reaching record low prices every day, so you can always find something worth picking up on the cheap. All your games are instantly sent straight to you, and if you have any issues, their lightning fast customer service will sort you out so you can get back to gaming as soon as possible. Check the link in the description to use instant gaming for yourself, and more importantly, support this here channel. Why pay more for games when you can just use instant gaming? So one more time, hit the link in the description and pick yourself up some games. Thanks to Instant Gaming for supporting the channel, and now back to the video. So yes, before anyone says anything, if you are good at managing cavalry and cycle charging, Grail Knights are better, but for your average player, Guardians are far easier to use well. They're incredibly tough with extremely high armor, shields, and crazy high defense. They also do excellent damage with great attack, weapon strength, and even half decent charge bonus. You can send them around on flanks using their excellent speed, have them charge in for big bursts of damage, and then stick around to clean up what's left. This works on backlines or the backs of front lines thanks to their brilliant melee stats. Add on their baseline at 15% damage resistance, perfect vigor, and immunity to psychology, and they're simply the best unit to set and forget. You just have to get them to charge in once, and they'll do just fine. The only real worry is them running out of ass to kick. Coming from the Chaos Dwarves, we have the Fireglaive Infernal Guard. The Chaos Dwarves didn't even exist last time I made one of these lists, but their roster is one of the most powerful in the game. Honourable mention to Blunderbusters since they do amazing for how early you can use them, but Fireglaives are just too absurdly broken to overlook. Range power first. They come with very respectable range and fantastic armor-piercing fire damage, meaning they can shoot basically anything and it's gonna hurt and hurt bad. Sure, they need line of sight, but since they're dwarves, most other factions stand above their troops, so it's not really that big a deal. The speed is slow if they need to get an angle, but nobody's perfect. Now, in melee, they're also somehow extremely strong. Super high armor and strong defense alongside charged defense versus large makes them very tanky, but they also have halfway decent attack alongside armor piercing fire damage with a bonus versus large. Anything that dares to try and flank and take them down on the backlines is in for a rude awakening once they realize they basically have to take down a powerful front line instead of a weak ranged unit. Honestly, these guys might be a little bit too powerful, but it's how they are, so they make the list. For the Demons of Chaos, since Daniel has no units unique to his faction, instead of just choosing one of the winners from the others, I'm going to go with what I feel is the runner-up for the best unit from one of the Monogod factions, and that is the Toad Dragon. Added with Thrones of Decay, this thing takes the crown as Nurgle's best monster. It may not have the bound spells of the Great Unclean One, but what it lacks in magic, it more than makes up for it in raw frontlines power. It's a pretty simple melee monster with very high attack and armor-piercing poison damage, and a bonus versus infantry. If it gets to the front lines, it will tear most enemies to shreds in moments. Defensively, it may not be the greatest with medium armor and moderate defense, but provided you don't just send it in to get surrounded or let enemy ranged fire on it all battle long, it should do just fine and rack up a ton of kills. Besides, you want to pull it out of combat regularly to make use of its magic vomit missiles ability, dealing huge damage and plummeting enemy stats. Maybe one day Daniel will get a rework and a unit of his own, but until that day, he has the Toad Dragon. For the Dark Elves, it's still Greatsword Shades, another faction lacking an update and another clear choice for their best unit. I looked for something else that I could justify picking instead, but nothing is as good. All Shades come with strong ranged power. Yes, they may not have the greatest range or ammo, but that much armor piercing on a unit with a curved firing arc is too good to ignore, even if they have to throw the missiles from 6 feet away. Greatswords in particular are the best for the melee side of the unit, the best overall melee stats of the bunch and the only one with armor piercing anti-infantry damage. They're not the powerhouses the Fireglaves are, but against weaker flanking units they'll hold their own at the very least, and at best even be able to take out their attackers. Add on their Vanguard and Stalk, allowing them to get off easy ambushes, and the Greatsword Shades are unlikely to be dethroned unless they give the Hydra an orbital laser. For the Dwarves, we have the Grudge Rakers. As much as my soul is calling for the Thunder Barge, no amount of missile resist can stop that thing from being a pincushion. Instead, another unit from the same DLC, the Grudge Rakers, are my pick for the Dowie. Almost identical to the regular Thunderers, with the exception of the range and damage, but the way they deal that damage is so powerful that I have no choice but to choose them. They're essentially non-Chaos blunderbusses, but somehow even better. Their barrages launch a tidal wave of lead at their targets, which results in bursts of damage so staggering that it literally staggers most things they fire at, slowing their movement to a crawl. Of course, as part of the Dwarves, they can get this damage off over frontline's heads in most cases, and if they find a large target, it's open season. Yes, the lower range does make them a little riskier to use well, but by God, the damage they deal is just crazy. In melee, they are worthless, with the exception of their armor and shields, giving them some protection, so keeping them back and safe is essential to their success. But if you can keep them at a range, the damage output is simply ludicrous. Moving over to the Empire, we have the Nuln Ironsides, yet another unit from the Thrones of Decay DLC, and honestly, it was a toss-up between these, the long rifles, and maybe even the volley gun tank. Two other units from the same DLC. Anywho, I went with the Ironsides since their damage output is the most consistent and devastating of the three. They may not have the range of the long rifles or the raw missile strength of the tank, but they deal fantastic damage from a decent range and keep up the pressure all battle long. Elephant in the room, yes, they are worthless if they get flanked, but good luck charging them down with this much lead coming your way. So obviously the base stats are good and all that. Very strong armor piercing split so they can cut through most tougher units with ease, but that Black Powder Discipline passive may not seem all that exciting, but once it comes online, it's honestly like giving them cheese. Suddenly, they've got aim lock and an increased fire rate like a Star-Lord ult in Marvel Rivals. By simply setting them in one position and letting them lock in, they elevate their already powerful missile damage into something magical. Not literally, they don't have magical damage, just to be clear. In my opinion, there's no reason to bring anything else when building missile units into an Empire army. Coming to Grand Cathay, I had to go with the Celestial Dragon crossbows. In making this list and replaying them recently, I've come to the conclusion that I kinda hate this roster. Their early game units kinda suck and their late game doesn't have anything particularly exciting either. With that said, the best they have is probably still the Celestial Dragon crossbows, another hybrid weapons unit with armor piercing range damage similar to the Shades. Are they anywhere near as good? I sure don't think so, but it is what it is. Let's start with the good, which is the ranged power. Decent armor piercing with a medium range and okay ammo. It's nothing all that exciting, but armor piercing in a curved firing arc is always strong, so I can only complain so much. In melee, they're fine, I guess. Very high armor and a shield make them relatively tough, but their melee stats are very mid, with essentially non-existent damage if they're up against armor. The Yin upgrade is mainly for their speed and reload speed, so is decent at upping their range damage, but not a lot else. Like I said, the roster needs some work, but this is as good as it gets in a single unit. For the Greenskins, I went with Black Orcs, not to be confused with Black Orcs parentheses, Great Weapons close parentheses, or as they were previously known, Black Orcs. No, I'm talking about the Black Orcs that come with the Omens of Destruction, and you may see their stat card and see a mid unit that doesn't really do much, but I see potential, and it all really comes down to their ability. Immovable Bulwark drops their attack by 24 to raise their defense by the same amount. This means they deal basically 0 damage, but with that weapon strength, what's the difference? However, it also means they're borderline unkillable. At their base level, this means nearly 70 defense, and in case you're not familiar with how stats in this game works, that means every single attack that comes their way in melee, they now have a nearly 70% chance to flat out ignore it. Add on their massive armor stats and a silver shield, and no matter what comes their way, unless it's a literal nuclear warhead, they're not going anywhere. This doesn't mean much for them, but for the rest of the roster, it means a whole lot. You can send in your monsters to deal all the damage you could ever need on the front lines, knowing these lads will protect them. You can flank around into enemy back lines, and their melee troops won't be able to save them. This one is probably a little controversial, since by itself, this unit can't win you a battle, but as part of an army, it can ensure victory without even getting a single kill. High Elves, Sisters of Avalon, another that still hasn't and likely will never change. Do I really need to talk about why this unit is so good? Massive range with a curved firing arc and extremely strong armor-piercing magical fire damage with some very light explosions on impact. In melee, they're not the best, but 38 defense isn't nothing, so they can hold their own until help arrives, no problem. Most of the time, enemies won't get that close and they'll pick entire armies apart without getting so much as a scratch themselves. Pretty much exactly what you think of when you imagine the most powerful unit in the game, and it's still pretty much true today. No need to be this dead horse any longer, we all know it's true, so let's move on. Coming to Khorne, we have Wrathmongers, another unit from the Omens of Destruction DLC, and this one could not be simpler or any more fitting for Khorne. It's just shirtless dudes who go absolutely sicko mode in melee combat. Now, don't let the lack of clothing fool you, they're actually pretty damn tough with high armor and defense. This means even with their small unit size, they're no simple task to get rid of, provided you have something taking care of enemy ranged. In the defense department, things get even better, with extremely high attack and armor piercing damage, only made better by their frenzy whilst at higher leadership. Again, the small entity count might make you worried that they're easily swarmed, but honestly, it hardly bothers them, as it's just another skull to harvest. I don't have a lot to say about these guys, since they just run headfirst into melee and devastate whatever they come across. For Kislev, similar to Cathay, I find their roster to be very mid. I don't think it's quite as bad, but the prevalence of hybrid weapons units mean most options they have are okay at a few jobs, but not exceptional at anything. So instead of picking something that's brilliant all game long, I'm instead going to go for something that's extremely strong given its low cost and availability in the early game, and that's the humble Kislevite warriors. A powerful unit you want to bring with you into the endgame? Perhaps not, but a strong front line that will see off most early threats with ease? I reckon so. Defensively, it's extremely respectable for the early game. Not a lot of armor, but pretty high defense and charge defense versus large make it very tough to push past, provided the enemy doesn't bring any ranged. Attack is a little low, but damage is armor piercing with a bonus versus large, making them decent against early game large threats. It's not exceptional, but for its place in the roster, and when you use it, I can't find any better value. Coming over to the Lizardmen, I went with the Engine of the Gods Ancient Stegodon, another unit that's an easy pick and always will be. So, you have this giant dinosaur that's extremely tanky and deals tons of damage in melee with armor-piercing anti-infantry damage. You have a weapons team on its back peppering nearby hostiles with constant poison damage. And of course, you have an orbital laser you can call down from the heavens that turns anything it touches into a fine mist. Oh, and you get 2 uses of that per battle, per unit. As if all of this wasn't enough, it also speeds up power recharge rate for your casters, causes terror, and provides a little bit of damage resist to nearby allies. It's as full a package as you can get in a single unit and is the best and most fun unit on the Lizardman roster. Sure, it's a giant, slow-moving pincushion for enemy ranged, and it doesn't have the best melee stats, but it's a dinosaur that can summon an orbital strike and kill things just by walking near them, so it wins anyway. From Norsca, I went with the Thamir Warriors. Now yeah, I know War Mammoths is great and all, but it's also a giant target for literally anything enemies want to throw at it. The Thamir Warriors, however, bring plenty of frontline power, whilst also being small targets and exceptionally tough ones at that. I don't really have a lot to say about these guys since they're a pretty straightforward strong unit. They have pretty good but not outstanding melee stats, and very high armor piercing, armor sundering, magical, anti-infantry damage. All this makes them great on the front lines, especially when working alongside some infantry for extra cover. Their damage output is consistent and will do excellent against most infantry. Their toughness is extremely strong from melee or range, with their 45% missile resistance when at high leadership. Real simple, but also real good and real easy to use. For Nurgle, I went with the Rot Knights. There's a ton of units from recent DLCs in this list, and I can't tell if it's recency bias or if they really are that good. Rot Knights fall into the same category as Grail Guardians, where they're just so strong and easy to use that it's difficult to do poorly when using them. They're nice and fast, especially for a Nurgle unit. They have great armor-piercing poison damage with a bonus versus large, alongside decent melee stats and even a good chunk of charge bonus. They can get on the flanks and target almost anything and do some great damage. Whether you want to use them to hunt down enemy cavalry, charge the back lines, or the backs of the front lines, they really can do it all. Not to mention regeneration, which will help keep them alive for a very long time when combined with their high toughness. Another unit you can pretty much just set and forget. As long as they're not battling something that directly counters them like high damage anti-large infantry, they should do great whether you go for charging or sustained combat. From the Ogre Kingdoms, I went with the Ogre Pistol Man-Eaters. Who'd have thought that the Ogres would have one of the best hybrid weapons units in the game? Not me, that's for damn sure, but these guys are legitimately extremely strong. On the range side, they have a medium range but high armor piercing damage. Yes, it's from a small number of entities, but should still hit hard against more or less anything. Add on their high speed and they can keep back and safe, or get in the flanks for massive value. In melee, they're also extremely impressive with decent melee stats and very high armor piercing damage. Add on their Ogre Charge and they can do all of the following jobs. Sit at the back firing at units from safety, getting on the flank to fire into enemy backs, getting involved in melee on the front lines, or getting on a flank and charging to the backs of said front lines or to the fronts of the back lines. With the exception of landing a kickflip, there isn't much they can't do in battle, so do yourself a favour and bring a bunch of them to do one or all of these jobs at once. From the Skaven, I went with the Poisoned Wind Mortars. They have one of the hardest factions to choose one best unit since they all have powerful options in every category, but the one that I think takes the title is the Poisoned Wind Mortar. It's another that does one job really well, and that job is ranged decimation. These things have artillery class range and use that to launch devastating barrages of armor-piercing magical poisoned wind damage that packs massive explosive power. If you get them in melee, they are hopeless, and they're also pretty slow so can't really run away. But if you keep them safe and sound, by God, they can rack up value. Forget artillery, just use these guys, as the damage really is absurd against clumps of infantry. They're great in almost every battle, and come in extremely handy during sieges, both attacking and defending. They're just a goated unit, and as satisfying to use as they are upsetting to have used against you. For Slaanesh, I went with the Chaos Knights of Slaanesh. I honestly think Slaanesh might have one of the worst rosters in the game at the moment. It's so tiny, and it's designed to be hard to use, making it a real challenge to find anything truly great. Granted, they're due a DLC presumably this year, but who knows at this point. It's kind of sad that a faction so well known for its charging power, and I'm going with a unit that isn't even truly theirs since it's just a reskin of a unit from the Warriors of Chaos. Big ol' asterisks on this one, however. If you are good at using chariots, then any of the Seekers or Hellflayers will almost certainly beat this, but for your average player, these are the best, since they're exceedingly easy to use. Another cav unit that's a good all-rounder, so tough with high armor and defense, decent in sustained combat with good melee stats and okay damage, and can also make a mean charge. Yes, I hear you, their damage isn't armor piercing, and whilst you're not wrong, it also doesn't make much difference if you use them right, and doing so is extremely easy. All you have to do is make sure they charge into the back of whatever they're targeting, and they'll deal plenty of damage. The devastating flanker trait doubles their charge bonus when they hit the back of their target, and suddenly their low damage is drastically increased and they can clean up whatever is left in sustained melee. They're not as good as most other units on this list, but to be honest, that's more to do with Slaanesh's roster being both weak and difficult to use, so a unit that's strong and easy to use for your average player is basically impossible. Honestly, just wait for him to get a DLC at this point. For the Tomb Kings, we have the Necropolis Knights, another unit that's in the same vein, but this one is actually really good. Strong stats across the board make it great at charging and sustained combat, high armor piercing and poison damage. The only downside of this one is the low leadership and the fact it's a construct, so if it loses confidence, it will literally fall to pieces. Aside from that, it's a great flanking camp unit that can charge in and stick around to finish off whatever's left. I'm not going over all of this again, since this is like the fourth unit that does the same job. From Tzeentch, I went with the Changebringers. This is another faction that I feel has a roster with no clear standout. They're not as bad as Slaanesh or even close, but nothing here really feels like a compulsory unit you can't miss out on when playing them. If I had to pick the unit I felt could get the most value the easiest, it would probably be the Changebringers. They're essentially flamers on flying chariots, allowing them to get an angle on basically anything. Now yes, they're not at all tough in any way, with painfully low armor and defense, but provided you remove any ranged or flying threat, they can get off fairly uncontested massive damage on anything you want in a favourable angle every time. The damage is short range but devastating, capable of wiping out entire units in a single barrage if you landed just right. If you landed just wrong, that entire unit might just be your own. Once they're out of ammo, they are basically worthless, but whilst they have it, they can be devastating. From the Vampire Coast, it's the Necrofex Colossus. In a game with giant monsters, the Necrofex stands above the rest, and it's probably not the reason you might think. Yes, it is also a powerful artillery piece with massive armor-piercing damage over an equally massive range, but the reason I think it's so strong is its girth, or lack thereof. This thing is very skinny compared to most other monsters, and that makes it marginally, and I do mean marginally, less vulnerable to ranged focus. Am I saying you should charge in and ignore enemy missile units? No, take them out as soon as you can, but if you can't, not only is it harder to hit, it can also outrange most other units anyway. It also helps that it can kick ass in melee too, so if it gets flanked or you just need something in melee, it does the job nicely. A fantastic hybrid weapons monster that's surprisingly difficult to take down. Just a shame it's on another of the most jank factions in the game. For the vampire counts, I went with the Terrorgeist. God, my babies really need an update. Their entire roster is low leadership units that disintegrate once they get to low leadership. If you can't see an issue with that, I don't really know what to tell you. The Terrorgeist is probably the best of a bad lot, but honestly it's kind of like being the most empathetic CEO, hardly a prize worth bragging about. Of course, it's a fast, flying monster with excellent melee damage and armor piercing, poison and bonus versus large. Honestly, it's still better versus infantry since its attacks deal excellent area damage, but they have barely anything else that deals anti-large, so whatever. It also has its powerful breath ability and regeneration, which is unironically very strong. Of course, leadership is pathetic, so prop it up with spells when needed, and don't send it in alone to get surrounded or focused by ranged, and it should be fine. It's actually relatively tough when it isn't being surrounded, so should do great versus most other targets. For the Warriors of Chaos, I went with the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth. For me, it ping-pongs between the two Dragon Ogre units, and today I landed on the Shaggoth. Is it because the name is what I want to do every night? Perhaps, but it's also a very strong unit. It's a basic but powerful monster with devastating melee power against pretty much anything. Armor piercing anti-large damage combined with high melee stats make it devastating no matter what you send it against. Add on the high speed and it makes you an excellent cavalry hunter or backlines flanker. It really can do it all, as long as all also means getting picked apart by ranged if you don't shut them down first. Aside from that teeny glaring weakness, it's fabulous and should be part of any army. And lastly, we come to the Wood Elves, and I went with the Zoes. Potentially controversial pick, not going for Weight Watchers, but I just love me some Zoes. Similar to Dragon Ogres, they're fast and decently strong battlers with armor piercing anti-large damage. They're not quite as good in melee, but against most targets they'll get the job done, provided they don't get surrounded by high damage. However, they also bring spell power into the mix with bound users of Earthblood and Flesh to Stone, allowing them to toughen and heal nearby allied units or themselves. When combined with their melee power, this means their potential value is off the charts massive beyond a trackable stat. Even if they're not fighting, this much extra magic without spending wins is extremely valuable and can keep your army in peak form for a whole lot longer. But that's my list. Let me know in the comments below what you think are the best units for every faction. Like, subscribe, check out Instant Gaming at the link below, and if you want more Warhammer 3 list videos, then check out this one all about the very best modded campaigns.